Ada Whitaker had been carrying a secret so heavy it had bent her spine by degrees, and on the morning she finally decided to speak it aloud, the sky over Calhoun Creek, Texas, broke open with the kind of gold light that made even the most hardened frontier woman believe in something larger than herself. It was the spring of 1878, and Calhoun Creek was the sort of town that existed in the space between civilization and wilderness, the kind of place where men wore their troubles on the outside and women wore theirs tucked behind their ribs. The town had a general store run by a near-deaf man named Horace Pratt, a saloon called the Dusty Spur that smelled of cheap whiskey and cheaper regrets, a small schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, and a livery stable that Gideon Morgan had run for the past 3 years, with the quiet competence of a man who understood horses better than he understood people. Ada had arrived in Calhoun Creek 7 months ago, stepping off a mail stage with a single trunk, a leather satchel, and a face so carefully composed it might have been carved from the limestone bluffs that bordered the town to the west. She was 26 years old, a schoolteacher hired to replace the previous one, a Mr. Connolly, who had drunk himself into an early grave somewhere out on the Pecos. She had brown hair that curled at her temples when the humidity rose, dark eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were already rough from years of life that had not been particularly gentle with her. She was not what most men would call fragile, and she had stopped hoping anyone would see her as delicate a long time ago. Gideon Morgan was 31, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same limestone as the bluffs. He had a way of moving through the world that was unhurried but never lazy, the gait of a man who knew exactly where he was going even when he did not. He had dark brown hair that went a little long at the collar, eyes the color of old copper that caught the light strangely in the early morning hours, and a reputation in Calhoun Creek as a man of few words and absolute reliability. If Gideon Morgan said he would have your horse ready at dawn, your horse was ready at dawn. If he said he would fix the south paddock fence before the storm hit, the fence was fixed. He was the kind of man the town leaned on without ever thinking to thank. Ada had noticed him on her second day in Calhoun Creek, when she had needed to hire a horse to ride out to the Dunmore place to meet the parents of 3 of her students. She had walked into the livery stable with her practical boots and her no-nonsense expression, and Gideon had looked up from the bridle he was mending, studied her for a moment with those copper-colored eyes, and said, without preamble, that the bay mare near the south stall was the calmest horse he owned, and would suit a new rider to the area just fine. Ada had told him with equal directness that she was not a new rider. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri and could handle a horse with or without a guide. Gideon had studied her for another moment, then nodded, and given her the bay mare anyway, because the bay mare was still the calmest horse he owned, and calm was never a bad thing on the open land outside Calhoun Creek. That had been the beginning of a friendship that neither of them had planned, and both of them had needed with a desperation they would not have admitted to anyone, including themselves. The friendship developed slowly, the way most real things do in the Wild West, where survival occupied most of the hours of the day and sentiment was a luxury that had to be squeezed in around the edges. Ada would return horses to the livery stable after her weekend rides and end up staying to talk about nothing in particular, about the weather coming down from the Panhandle, about the new family that had settled near Mule Springs Creek, about the books she was using with her students, and whether the children were taking to reading the way children ought to. Gideon would listen more than he talked, but when he talked, what he said mattered. He told her once, while working a knot out of a rope with patient fingers, that he thought there was something stubborn about this land that matched something stubborn in certain people, and that he had always respected both for it. Ada had looked at him with something soft flickering behind her careful eyes and said that she thought he was probably right. The town of Calhoun Creek had its own rhythms and its own tensions, as all frontier towns did in the years following the Civil War and the chaos that had followed it westward. There was a man named Clarence Tull who owned the largest parcel of land outside town, and who had spent the past 2 years gradually pressuring smaller ranchers and settlers to sell to him or face consequences that ranged from subtle to not subtle at all. Tull was not a violent man by preference, but he employed men who were, and in the territory of Texas in 1878, the law was thin on the ground and often arrived too late to be useful. Ada had discovered, entirely by accident, the specific shape of what Clarence Tull was doing, 6 months after her arrival in Calhoun Creek, in November of 1877. She had gone to the county land office in the larger town of Harwick, 12 miles east, to look up the deed records for the school property, which was technically owned by the county, and which she needed for a letter she was writing to the State Education Board about funding. While she was there, turning through the heavy leather ledgers with their crabbed script, she had found something that had made her go very still. A series of land transfers going back 18 months, each one stamped legitimate and signed by the county land agent, a man named Ira Boone. The transfers all ran in one direction, from smaller homesteaders to a holding company called the Meridian Land Trust, and the Meridian Land Trust, as Ada discovered when she turned to the incorporation filings, was owned in its entirety by Clarence Tull. That alone would have been unremarkable. Land consolidation was a common and legal practice, even when it was accomplished through pressure and intimidation. What made Ada's hands go cold was the name she found on 3 of the deeds as a witness, a signature that should not have been there, that could not legitimately have been there given the dates on the documents, because the man whose name was written as witness had, according to the date of death recorded in the back of the same ledger as a matter of county record, died 11 days before he allegedly witnessed those documents. A dead man had signed 3 legal land transfers, which meant the transfers were fraudulent, which meant that at least 3 families, the Kettermans, the Sousa family who had come up from the Rio Grande Valley, and old widow Dunmore whose children attended Ada's school, had been cheated out of their land by forged documents and a corrupt county agent. Ada had stood very still in that cold county office for a long time. Then she had carefully written down every relevant detail in the small notebook she always carried in her satchel. She had walked out of the building with her face composed, ridden back to Calhoun Creek on the rented stage, gone to her small room above the schoolhouse, and sat on the edge of her bed while her hands shook. She knew what she knew. And she knew what knowing it could cost. Clarence Tull was not a man who tolerated complications. The previous schoolteacher, Mr. Connolly, had reportedly spoken at a town meeting about Tull's methods before he had succumbed to his drinking, but there were people in Calhoun Creek who believed Mr. Connolly's sudden and rapid decline had been helped along by something more than whiskey. There was no proof of that. There was never any proof in these matters. Ada was alone. She had no family in Texas, no powerful connections, no husband whose social standing might have offered her some protection. She was a schoolteacher in a small frontier town, and the children she taught were the children of the very families she would be trying to help. If she spoke and Tull moved against her, the children lost their teacher and possibly their families lost more than land. So she had kept quiet. She had gone about her days, teaching multiplication and reading primers and the history of the Republic, and she had watched Gideon Morgan from across the distance of her secret, and she had felt the distance grow between them like a crack in dry earth. It was not that the secret was specifically about Gideon. It was that carrying it had made her smaller, more careful, more closed off, and she was someone who had worked very hard to be none of those things. It had started to change how she sat at her desk, how she answered questions in town, how she listened when Horace Pratt at the general store complained about rising prices, because she knew the prices were rising because Tull was buying up competition and controlling supply routes, but she could not say so. It had changed something between her and Gideon as well, because Gideon was attentive in the way of a man who was falling in love with someone, even if he had not yet organized his feelings into anything as coherent as that acknowledgement, and he had begun to notice that Ada seemed to be carrying something she would not put down. He had asked her about it twice, gently, in his direct way, and both times she had deflected with skill enough that most people would have been satisfied. Gideon was not most people. He had seen the deflection and had not pressed it, but he had also not let it go entirely. She could see it in the way he watched her sometimes, with that careful attention, as if he were waiting for something. The thing that finally broke the silence open was a small and terrible catalyst. On a Tuesday morning in April of 1878, Ada arrived at the schoolhouse to find that 8 of her 23 students were absent. When she went around town asking, she learned that the Ketterman family had left overnight, their wagon gone, their small house empty, the doors hanging open in the spring wind. They had not said goodbye to anyone. Neighbors reported that 2 of Tull's men had been seen riding toward the Ketterman place 3 days prior. The Sousa family was still there, but barely. The eldest daughter, Maria, coming to school with a bruise along her jaw that she said she had gotten from a fall, but whose shape was exactly that of a large hand. Old Widow Dunmore had received a formal notice from a county lawyer that the land she was living on was no longer legally hers, and that she had 30 days to vacate. Ada sat at her teacher's desk after the children went home that afternoon, and she held her notebook with its careful list of facts. And she thought about 6 months of silence, and what it had cost, and what it was still costing, and something inside her that had been bent by the weight of knowing finally straightened. She was going to speak, and the person she was going to speak to first was Gideon Morgan. She was not entirely sure why she chose him first, except that in the 7 months she had lived in Calhoun Creek, he was the person who had come to feel most like solid ground, and she was standing in mud and needed something to hold on to. Except that she was half in love with him and too practical to pretend otherwise to herself, even if she had been pretending it to everyone else, including him, for months now. She found him in the livery stable in the late afternoon, as she usually did, where the light came through the wide doors in long amber columns, and the smell of hay and horse and leather was as familiar to her by now as the smell of chalk dust in the schoolroom. He was brushing down a roan gelding that belonged to one of the ranchers out on the eastern pasture land, working in long, even strokes with his back to her. He heard her come in. She knew he did because his hands paused for a fraction of a second before continuing, that small betrayal of awareness that he had never quite managed to suppress when she entered a room. "Miss Ada," he said, without turning. "I need to tell you something," she said. He stopped brushing then. He turned to look at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him put the brush down on the stall rail without breaking her gaze, giving her his full and undivided attention. "Then tell me," he said. She told him, all of it. She pulled the notebook from her satchel and read him the specific entries, and then she put the notebook away, and she talked for a long time while Gideon stood very still and listened with the whole of himself, the way he did when something mattered. She told him about the dead man's signature. She told him about Ira Boone and the Meridian Land Trust. She told him about Widow Dunmore's notice and Maria Sousa's bruised jaw and the Ketterman family's empty house. She told him she had known for 6 months and had said nothing, and that she was sorry for the saying nothing, but she was not going to say nothing anymore. When she finished, the livery stable was very quiet except for the sound of horses shifting in their stalls and the wind moving across the open doors. The golden afternoon light had gone deep amber, almost orange, and it fell across Gideon's face and made his expression very clear to read. He was angry. Not at her, or at least not primarily at her, though she could see there was something complicated working in him about the 6 months. He was angry about the Kettermans and Widow Dunmore and Maria Sousa's jaw and the dead man who had been made to sign things after his death, and the anger in him was the kind that did not burst and scatter, but instead compressed down into something dense and purposeful. "All right," he said. His voice was very steady. "I need you to tell me something honest, Ada." She met his eyes. "I have been telling you honest things." "I know you have." He took a breath. "Why did you wait 6 months?" She could have given him a practical answer. She had several good practical answers ready, about safety and the children and the lack of legal recourse and the remoteness of any official authority who might help. All of those things were true, but standing in the amber light of his livery stable with his copper-colored eyes on her face, she gave him the full, honest answer instead. "Because I was afraid," she said, "and because I was alone in it. And because I knew if I started pulling at this thread, something might unravel that I could not put back together, and the children I am responsible for would be caught in the middle of whatever came apart." A beat of silence. "And now?" he asked. "Now I am still afraid," she said. "But I am more afraid of what happens if I keep quiet than of what happens if I speak. And I am—" She stopped. She was not given to incomplete sentences. She started again. "I am tired of carrying this alone." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle and it was significant. He looked at her in a way that was different from how he had looked at her before, more direct, more unguarded, as if the thing that had been building between them for months had just clarified itself into a shape he could name. "You are not alone in it now," he said. "You understand that." "I was hoping you would say that," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something close. "I should have said it 6 months ago if I had known there was something to say it about." She looked at him for a moment. "I know." He picked up the brush he had set down, and then he immediately put it back down again, because there was no good reason to pick it up. He ran a hand over the back of his neck and let out a long, slow breath. "The county land office is in Harwick. The nearest federal land office is in Austin." 200 and some miles, she said. "A hard ride, yes. But a man with documented fraud evidence and a federal land claim petition can get a hearing that a county agent cannot shut down because the county agent himself is implicated." He was thinking out loud, she could see it. The same methodical way he worked through problems in the physical world now applied to this one. "We need copies of those records." "I made copies," she said. She tapped the satchel. He looked at the satchel, then he looked at her. "Of course you did." "I am a teacher," she said. "I keep records." This time the corner of his mouth did more than move. It rose fully, and the smile that came with it changed his face in a way that made her chest feel strange and tight and warm, all at the same time. She had not seen him smile like that before, uncalculated, genuine, the kind of smile that belonged to a private moment and not a public one. "All right, then," he said. "We go to Harwick first to confirm the record is still as you found it and has not been altered, and we make additional certified copies with a proper witness. Then we determine how to get word to Austin without Tull's network intercepting it." "His network," she said, because the word was notable. "Tull has men on both the eastern and western stage routes," Gideon said. "He funded the relay station at Mule Springs 4 years ago. He has friendly arrangements with certain riders." His expression darkened slightly. "I have suspected for some time that the mail out of Calhoun Creek is not as private as it ought to be." Ada absorbed this. "Then we cannot send the evidence by mail." "No, someone would have to carry it personally." "Yes." "To Austin." "Yes." She thought about this. "How long is the ride?" 4 or 5 days hard riding depending on weather and the river crossings." He looked at her steadily. "I know the route. I have made it twice. I have a horse that can make it in 4 days if the weather holds." "1 horse," she said. "2," he said. "I'm not making that ride and leaving you here alone with what you know. You said yourself you are done carrying it alone." Something moved through her that was warm and that she did not have a precise name for, though she suspected she could have found one if she tried. "When?" she asked. "Not tonight. We need to prepare. We need to be careful about how we leave because if Tull's men see us riding east together with a satchel, questions will get asked before we are out of range." He considered. 3 days. "We tell no one the real reason." We go to Harwick, we get the certified copies, and then we ride south to pick up the Austin Road at Bridger's Crossing rather than the Eastern Stage route. That is the longer way. That is the safer way, she nodded slowly. Then, without planning to, she said, Gideon, thank you. He looked at her with those copper-colored eyes and the directness that was as much a part of him as his hands and his voice. I told you, you are not alone in it now. She held his gaze for one long moment, and then she nodded again, and she left the livery stable with her spine straighter than it had been in 6 months. The 3 days of preparation were delicate ones. Ada went about her teaching with extra care, making sure her students had clear assignments that could be managed by the older ones in her absence, knowing she would need to give the town some reasonable explanation for missing a week of school. She settled on a story about a sick cousin in Harwick who needed nursing, which was plausible enough and specific enough to satisfy the politely curious people of Calhoun Creek. She also spent time in those 3 days watching Clarence Tull more carefully than she had let herself do before, now that the decision was made and the watching had a purpose. Tull was a man in his late 40s, heavyset, with the kind of surface charm that functioned as a social lubricant in a small frontier community. He came to church on Sundays. He contributed generously to the school fund every fall. He was a man who had made himself indispensable to the social fabric of the town in ways that made it very difficult for anyone to speak against him, without feeling as though they were attacking the community itself. Ada watched him donate a sack of dried beans to the Dunmore widow at the Sunday service, watched him press the old woman's hands with apparent warmth and genuine-seeming concern, and felt her stomach turn over slowly and completely. She kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. Gideon came to Sunday service as he always did, sat in his usual spot 3 pews from the back, and did not look at Ada more than he normally would have, which was to say he looked at her once, a brief meeting of eyes over the heads of the congregation, and in that glance passed something that felt like a steadying hand on her shoulder even across the physical distance. On Wednesday morning they left Calhoun Creek. They went at the ordinary hour, separately at first, Ada riding her usual bay mare and Gideon on his sorrel gelding he called Justice, which was not an ironic name. They joined up on the eastern road just past the feed lot at the edge of town, where anyone watching would have assumed they were simply riding the same direction, and had naturally fallen into company, which was a common enough thing in the sparsely populated landscape west of Harwick. They rode mostly in comfortable quiet for the first hour, the spring morning cool and clear around them, the scrubgrass and mesquite on either side of the packed-earth road moving gently in a wind that came down from the north. The sky was the extraordinary blue of a Texas spring morning, the kind of color that made you understand why people had left everything familiar to come to this strange, vast, difficult land. "You are quieter than usual," Gideon observed at some point in the second hour. "I am thinking," she said, "about the land records." She considered for a moment. "Some and some about other things." He glanced at her. "Such as?" She glanced back. "I have been thinking that I should have told you sooner. Not just for the practical reasons. She looked ahead at the road. "I have been thinking that I made a mistake in judgment about what I could trust you with. And that is a mistake worth naming." The silence that followed was not empty. Gideon let it settle for a few strides before he spoke. "I think you were being careful," he said, "and I think, if I am honest, that I had not yet given you enough reason to trust me with something that large. We had talked, and I had been glad for the talking, but I had not—" He stopped, started again. "I have not been good, in general, at letting people know where they stand with me." "I noticed," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes, you would have. You are not difficult to read," she said. "You are just very—" she chose her word carefully. "Still, you are very still on the outside. It takes some time to see what is on the inside." "And what do you see?" he asked. His voice was even, but there was something in it that was not, some undercurrent of attention. She looked at the road ahead. The morning was warming around them and the blue of the sky was deepening. She thought about 6 months of watching him from the safe distance of her secret. of the way she had cataloged the small details of him because she could not help herself, the way he pressed his thumb along a seam when he was thinking, the way he always checked on the oldest horses before he locked up for the night, the way he had once, during a particularly cold January week, quietly stacked extra firewood on the schoolhouse porch without telling anyone he had done it. "I see a man who is honest," she said, "and patient, and good in the fundamental way, not the performed way." She glanced at him briefly. "And I see a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and has not quite decided what to do about the waiting. A beat, a long beat. That is fairly precise," he said finally. "I told you, you are not difficult to read." They rode in silence again for a while, but it was a different silence than before. Something had opened in it. They reached Harwick by mid-afternoon. The town was larger than Calhoun Creek, with a proper hotel and a more established commercial district along its main street, the kind of town that had begun to feel its own weight and permanence after a decade of existence. The county land office was a squat stone building at the north end of the main street, between a surveyor's office and a barber. They tied their horses and went in together. The county land agent, Ira Boone, was not there, which was either fortunate or a problem, depending on what was needed. A young clerk with ink-stained fingers and a slightly nervous demeanor was manning the office in his absence. Ada, who had been here before and had established herself on her previous visit as a diligent and detail-oriented researcher, asked to see the same land records she had consulted 6 months ago, citing a need to verify information for a county education funding application. This was the kind of routine bureaucratic activity that the clerk could accommodate without involving his superior, and so he accommodated it. Ada and Gideon sat across from each other at the wide wooden table where the land records were spread, and Ada walked him through each entry with her notebook beside her, confirming that the records were unchanged from what she had found in November. They were unchanged. The dead man's signatures were there, in ink that was dry and settled, and had been there for well over a year. Gideon looked at the signatures for a long time. His jaw was set, and his expression was the compressed one she had come to recognize as deep and purposeful anger. "We need 2 certified copies," she said quietly. He nodded. "I will ask the clerk to certify copies with the official county stamp. He can do that without Boone's presence, since it is a standard request for record verification." He went to the clerk. Ada watched from the table, watching also Gideon's posture and the way he spoke to the young man, calm and unhurried, giving no indication of why the copies were being made, and the clerk nodded and complied without hesitation. The stamp came down twice, crisp and official. They left the building with the certified copies in Ada's satchel alongside her original notes, and the original records still sitting in the county office undisturbed, which was important, because those records would be the ones a federal investigator would need to examine. "Boone will know someone came to look at those records," Ada said, once they were mounted and moving south toward the Bridgers Crossing Road. "The clerk will likely mention it," Gideon agreed. "Which means we have some window of time before Boone contacts Tull. Given the distance and the communication limitations, I would estimate we have 3 days before Tull knows specifically what has been looked at." "Will that be enough time?" "It will have to be." They rode south. The landscape changed as they went, the flat scrubgrass giving way gradually to a more varied terrain of low hills and cedar breaks, the kind of country that was beautiful in a quiet way that required patience to appreciate. They made camp that first night on a flat ledge above a small creek, where Gideon built a fire that was warm but low and smokeless, the kind of fire you made when you did not want to advertise your position, which was a skill Ada did not have and noted him employing. She had brought provisions in her saddlebag, dried biscuits and salt pork and coffee, and she made the coffee while he tended the horses, and they ate together by the fire with the night sky open and absurd above them, the stars so thick in that dark Texas sky that they seemed almost to make a sound. "My father used to say the stars in Missouri were good stars," Ada said, looking up. I did not know what he meant until I came to Texas. The stars in Missouri are fine. The stars out here are something else. Everything out here is something else, Gideon said. He was sitting with his back against a rock and his arms resting on his knees, and the firelight on his face made him look younger somehow, or perhaps just more himself. I came out from Tennessee 12 years ago. My brother and I, after the war, we thought we would find something. Ada looked at him. He did not often speak about his past, and she did not interrupt. My brother went north, he said. Colorado Territory. He is doing well up there, last I heard. Has a cattle operation and 2 boys. A pause. I came further west. I cannot entirely explain why. Something about this country fit something in me that nothing before it had. The stubbornness, she said. You mentioned that once. How you respected it. He looked at her. Yes, that. She looked at her coffee cup. My father died when I was 17, my mother 2 years later. I had a small inheritance from my father's farm, enough for teacher's college and a few years of modest independence. I taught in Missouri for 4 years, then in Kansas for 2. She turned the cup in her hands. I applied for this position in Texas because I wanted to see if I could stand in a place that required standing in. And can you? I seem to be standing, she said. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely decode, but that made her feel seen in a way she was not entirely comfortable with, because being seen meant being known, and being known meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability was something she had spent a long time being careful about. You are more than standing, he said. What you did, going to that land office, writing all of this down, keeping it safe for 6 months, coming forward now when you knew the cost, that is not just standing. That is something more. I was frightened, she said. I want to be honest about that. I was not brave. I was frightened, and then eventually I was more frightened of the wrong thing than of the right thing. That is exactly what brave is, he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze with that copper-colored steadiness. The fire crackled between them, and the creek below them ran over its stones with a soft, continuous sound. And Ada Whitaker, who had been careful about being known for a very long time, felt something crack open in her chest like a window in a house too long shut. Gideon, she said. Ada, he said. She almost laughed. It released the pressure somewhat. I am, she stopped. She started again. I think I have been doing something for several months that I have not been entirely honest with myself about. And what is that? Caring about you, she said, plainly, because she was a woman who valued plainness when she could get herself to it, more than as a neighbor or a friend. In the way that is, she waved a hand slightly because she was articulate in most contexts but not apparently in this one. In the way that creates complications. Silence. The fire. The creek. The absurd Texas stars. All right, he said. His voice was quiet and very careful. She looked at him. All right is not much of a response. No, he agreed. It is not. He shifted slightly, uncrossing his legs and leaning forward, and in the firelight his face was open in a way she had not seen it before. I have been doing the same thing for approximately 5 months, possibly longer if I am being honest about when it started as opposed to when I admitted it. She stared at him. 5 months. At minimum. You said nothing. Neither did you. She opened her mouth and then closed it. Then she said, "We are very stupid." Probably, he agreed. And there was the smile again, the real one that changed his face, and she felt the warmth in her chest spread through her like the first good heat of spring after a long winter. What do we do about it? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Right now we get to Austin and we file the federal land claim and we try to help 3 families get their land back. And after that is settled, when we are not riding through the dark with fraudulent land records in a saddlebag, I would like very much to court you properly if you are willing. She considered this. Court me? Yes, with your permission. You are asking my permission to court me while we are sitting by a campfire in the middle of nowhere with what might be a corrupt county agent about to alert a land grabber to what we are doing. That is correct. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Yes, I am willing." He nodded, as if the most significant thing in his world had just been confirmed, which perhaps it had. "Good," he said. "Then let us get some sleep. We have a long ride tomorrow." They rode 2 more days south and east before picking up the Austin Road at Bridger's Crossing, which was a small settlement built around a reliable crossing of a tributary of the Colorado River. They crossed the river without difficulty in the dry spring conditions and joined the Austin Road with another 3 days of riding before them. The ride was not without its difficulties. On the 4th day, they encountered a stretch of road where a late-season cold snap had turned the mud treacherous, and they had to walk the horses for 3 hours through sucking clay that pulled at every step. Ada's boots were soaked through and her back ached, and she did not complain about either, which Gideon noticed with what appeared to be deepening regard. He made her laugh on the 4th evening, telling her about a truly spectacular failure he had made his first year in Calhoun Creek, when he had miscalculated the weight capacity of a paddock fence he had repaired, and a neighbor's mule had gone through it like paper within 20 minutes of the repair being declared finished. He told it on himself without self-pity and with such dry precision that Ada laughed until she had to press her hand against her ribs, and the laughter felt like something physical being released from her body, something that had been clenched for months. "You are funny," she told him, slightly accusatory as if he had been withholding this information. "I have my moments," he allowed. "You hide them. I am selective about the audience." She looked at him in the last light of the 4th day's sun, slanted and gold across the rolling Texas hill country, and she thought that she could love this man with the whole of herself if she let herself, which was a thought she had been circling for months and was only now letting herself stand still in. They arrived in Austin on the 5th day, saddle-sore and dust-covered and more alive in some essential way than either of them had been when they left Calhoun Creek. Austin in 1878 was a proper city by frontier standards, with the state capitol building presiding over a grid of streets that were busy with commerce and government business, its population of several thousand having grown steadily since the end of the war. The Federal Land Office was a substantial building near the Capitol, with an American flag hanging above its door, and the kind of interior that suggested bureaucratic permanence. They went directly there without stopping to eat or change, because neither of them wanted to lose another hour. The federal land agent was a man named Theodore Marsh, in his 50s, with the tired but scrupulous manner of a man who had spent a career doing careful work in a difficult environment. Ada presented her certified copies and her original notes with the methodical clarity of someone who had organized this information in her mind during 5 days of riding and could present it in precisely the order that would be most effective. Marsh looked at the documents. He looked at the signatures of the dead man. He looked at the dates. He looked up at Ada and then at Gideon, who was standing behind her left shoulder with his arms at his sides, and his expression saying very clearly that he was prepared to stand there for as long as this took. "These are serious allegations," Marsh said. "Yes," Ada said. "They are also documented." Marsh looked at the documents again. He sent his clerk to retrieve several additional reference books from a back room, and he spent 20 minutes cross-referencing what Ada had brought against what his office had on record for the Meridian Land Trust and for Ira Boone's County Land Office. When he looked up the second time, something had sharpened in his expression. "The Meridian Land Trust filed federal homestead opposition claims in this office 7 months ago," he said. "We approved them on the basis of the county-certified land transfers. If the county transfers are fraudulent, then the federal opposition claims were approved on fraudulent grounds," Ada said. "Yes." Marsh was already reaching for a ledger. "We will need to open a formal investigation. You will both need to give sworn depositions today." They gave the depositions. It took 3 hours, and Ada's hand cramped from writing, and when it was over, Theodore Marsh told them that federal investigators would be dispatched to Harwick within 10 days, that Ira Boone would be served with a federal inquiry notice, and that the land transfers in question would be suspended pending investigation. "What about Tull himself?" Gideon asked. "If the investigation finds that the Meridian Land Trust was formed and operated with knowledge of the fraudulent transfers, which I think is very likely," Marsh said carefully. Then Mr. Tull will face federal charges for land fraud and conspiracy. That process takes time. I will not pretend otherwise. And the families who lost their land, Ada asked. If the transfers are voided, the land reverts to the previous deed holders. Marsh looked at her directly. I cannot guarantee the timeline. I can guarantee that this office will pursue it. It was not everything. It was something real. They walked out of the federal land office into the Austin afternoon sunshine, and Ada stood on the wide stone steps and let out a breath that seemed to have been lodged in her lungs for 6 months, a breath so long and complete that it left her feeling slightly hollow and entirely lighter. She felt Gideon's hand close around hers. It was the first time he had touched her, deliberately and with intent, and the contact ran through her palm and up her arm and lodged somewhere near her heart. "It has started," he said. "It has started," she agreed. She looked at their joined hands. He was looking at her face. "Thank you," she said, "for coming with me, for all of this." "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." They stayed one night in Austin at a proper hotel, 2 separate rooms, and ate a proper dinner at a table with a white cloth, which felt slightly surreal after 5 days of campfire cooking. And they talked through dinner with the ease of 2 people who have been through something together and arrived on the other side of it changed. They talked about the investigation and what it meant for Calhoun Creek and for Widow Dunmore and the Sousa family. They talked about whether the Ketterman family could be located and brought back. They talked about what Tull's response would be when the federal notice arrived, whether he would attempt intimidation or retreat. And then, over coffee that was considerably better than anything either of them had managed over a campfire for 5 nights, the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when the urgent matters are settled enough to allow the personal one's room. "Tell me something about yourself that you have not told anyone in Calhoun Creek," she said. He thought about it. "I wanted to be a doctor," he said. "When I was 17, I had started reading whatever medical texts I could get my hands on. Then the war started and I was in it, and after the war," he paused. "The things I saw during the war made medicine feel like a complicated thing to pursue. I did not want to be surrounded by those particular kinds of loss professionally when I had already been surrounded by them personally." She looked at him with something soft and serious in her eyes. "I did not know you served. I do not speak of it often." "Which side?" She asked it directly because in 1878 this was still a question that mattered, that carried weight, that could change the temperature of a room. "Union," he said. "I am from eastern Tennessee, the mountain counties." "We did not universally share the same sentiments as the lowland counties." She nodded. "My father was Union as well. Missouri was complicated." "Missouri was very complicated," he agreed, with the gravity of understatement. They looked at each other across the white tablecloth with the weight of the war somewhere between them, acknowledged and set aside, the way the generation of people who had lived through it generally handled it, because there was no other workable approach. "Your turn," he said. "I used to paint," she said. "Watercolors. I was good enough that my teacher in Missouri thought I should pursue it seriously. I chose teaching instead because it was more reliable and because I liked the work of it, the actual daily work of opening a mind to something new. But I have missed the painting." She looked at her hands. "I have thought since coming to Texas that this country deserves to be painted. It is unlike anything I imagined before I saw it." "You should paint it then." "I do not have the materials." "Materials can be obtained." She looked up at him. "You make everything sound manageable." "Most things are," he said. "The ones that are not you deal with differently." She smiled. It was the full version of her smile, not the careful one she wore in public, and he looked at it as if it were a remarkable thing, which she found she did not mind at all. The ride back to Calhoun Creek took 5 days as well, a different route this time, one that took them through somewhat more settled country and allowed them the occasional comfort of a way station meal. The days had a rhythm to them that felt, to Ada, like the beginning of something rather than the middle of something, a sensation she had not expected on what was technically a return journey. They talked constantly and also in comfortable silence, and also in the kind of half-language that develops between two people who are learning each other at speed. Because the circumstances had compressed what might have taken a year of drawing-room courtship into 10 days of riding and sleeping under stars and sharing provisions, and discovering what the other person was made of when things were not comfortable. On the 6th day out of Austin, with Calhoun Creek 2 days ahead, they camped on a hilltop that overlooked a wide, shallow valley, where a ribbon of creek caught the last light of a sunset that was pink and gold and lavender in layers, extraordinary even by the standard of Texas sunsets. They sat together on the same side of the fire for the first time, rather than across from each other, and Ada was aware of the warmth of him beside her with a specificity that was pleasant and somewhat destabilizing. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it." He turned to look at her. He was close enough that she could see the individual details of his face in the firelight, the line at the corner of his eye, the way his jaw was dark with several days of growth, the quality of steadiness in him that was as fundamental as the limestone of the bluffs back home. "I have not been, for a long time, a man who planned beyond the practical things," he said. "I have planned for the horses and the stable and the winter stores and what needed to be fixed and when. I have not planned for," he paused, finding words with the care he applied to everything, "for the things that are not practical. I told myself it was because the timing was not right or the circumstances. I think it was, in fact, because I had not found a person who made the impractical things feel real and worthwhile. I think," he paused again, "I think you are that person for me, and I want you to know that." She looked at him. The fire was warm and the valley below them was full of fading light and the stars were beginning to appear above the hills to the east. "Gideon," she said, "Ada, I think you are that person for me also." He reached out and took her hand with the same deliberate intentionality as he had on the Austin steps, and she turned her hand in his and held on. And they sat like that while the sunset finished itself and the stars came out in full, and the fire burned down to coals, and neither of them needed to say anything more because what needed to be said had been said. They returned to Calhoun Creek on a Thursday afternoon, riding in from the south on the Bridgers Crossing Road, dusty and trail-worn, and noticeably present to each other in a way that the town, small and observant as small towns always are, immediately registered. Horace Pratt watched them ride past the general store from his doorway with the knowing expression of a man who has seen this kind of return before. The widow Calloway, who lived across from the livery stable, noted the way Gideon held Ada's horse while she dismounted, and the particular quality of his attention, which was not the attention of a man being courteous to a neighbor. Ada returned to her students the next Monday with the story that her sick cousin in Harwick had recovered, which satisfied everyone sufficiently. She went back to her teaching with something different in her chest, lighter and more solid at the same time, the way things are when a burden has been shared and a truth has been told. 2 weeks after their return, 3 things happened in sequence. The first was that a federal letter arrived at the Harwick County office for Ira Boone, the content of which became town gossip within 48 hours, traveling the 12 miles between Harwick and Calhoun Creek by word of mouth faster than any horse. The letter was a formal notification of federal investigation into the land records of Harwick County, related to the Meridian Land Trust. The second thing was that Clarence Tull visited the Calhoun Creek schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon after the children had gone home. Ada was erasing the blackboard when he came in. She turned to face him with chalk dust on her fingers and her spine straight. Tull was a big man who used his size to fill a room, and he filled the schoolroom doorway with an expression that was calibrated to suggest benevolent concern, while communicating something considerably less benevolent. He said that he had heard about some complications with county records, some misunderstandings, and that he hoped she was not troubling herself unnecessarily about matters that were above a schoolteacher's purview. Ada looked at him with dark eyes that missed nothing. "I am a schoolteacher," she said. "My purview is whatever I determine it to be." His expression shifted, very slightly, in a direction that was less benevolent. He said a few more things, wrapped in politeness but weighted with implication, about the vulnerability of a woman alone in a frontier town, about the precariousness of a teaching position that was ultimately funded by community goodwill, about the general wisdom of keeping one's head down. Ada listened to all of it. Then she said, "Mr. Tull, I have already given sworn depositions to a federal land agent. What you are saying to me now is something you will want to think carefully about, because intimidating a federal witness carries its own consequences." A silence. "Federal witness," he said. "Yes," she said. He left without saying anything more. She stood very still until she heard his horse move away from the schoolhouse, and then she sat down in her teacher's chair for a full 5 minutes before she trusted her legs to carry her to the livery stable. Gideon was in the livery when she arrived, and he listened to her account of the conversation with that particular compressed attention, and then he said, with calm certainty, that Tull was not going to touch her because the risk was too high with a federal investigation already open. "How certain are you of that?" she asked. "Certain enough that I am not going to leave you alone in this town until it is resolved, whatever that takes." She looked at him. "You cannot follow me everywhere." "I am not suggesting I follow you everywhere. I am suggesting that Tull is a calculating man who has just had his calculation rearranged considerably, and a calculating man does not commit an additional federal offense when one is already underway." He met her eyes. "But I will be paying attention, and the town will be paying attention. Tull does not have the privacy here that he thinks he does." He was right. The third thing that happened in those 2 weeks was that the story began to move through Calhoun Creek, in the organic way that stories move through small communities, not announced but whispered and passed from person to person, that the land transfers some families had been pressured into might not have been legal, that there was an investigation, that someone in town had been the one to bring it forward. No one knew for certain who that someone was. But people made educated guesses, and those guesses were accompanied by a quiet shift in the way the community oriented itself. The Sousa family found that 3 of their neighbors were suddenly more willing to help with fence repairs and harvest preparation. Old Widow Dunmore received a letter from the federal land office confirming that her eviction notice had been suspended pending investigation. The town, which had been cowed in Tull's direction for 2 years, began, by small degrees, to straighten. It was not a dramatic or cinematic shift. It was the kind of thing that happened slowly, and then was fully present without any particular moment you could point to as its arrival. But it was real. Gideon came to the schoolhouse that same Thursday evening with a small paper parcel under his arm. Ada answered the door still in her teaching clothes, with ink on her right hand, and he held out the parcel. She opened it. Inside was a small set of watercolor paints, 6 colors in tin cases, 2 brushes, and a small pad of proper watercolor paper. It was not the most complete set she had ever owned, but it was clearly the best he had been able to source in Calhoun Creek, which probably meant he had written to someone in Harwick or arranged an order through Horace Pratt. She looked at the paints for a long moment, and then she looked at him. "You remembered," she said. "I remember most things you say," he told her. Simply, without embellishment, in the way he said things that were entirely true. She held the paints carefully, the way you hold a thing that means more than its physical weight, and she thought that this was what it felt like when someone paid attention to you with their whole self, when someone heard what you said and kept it and acted on it not because it was useful but because it mattered to you. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had something in it that she did not try to conceal. "You are very welcome," he said. They stood in the doorway for a moment in the early evening light, the town moving quietly behind him and the schoolhouse warm and lit behind her, and then she stepped back and said, "Come in. I will make coffee." He came in. She made coffee. They sat at her small table in her small kitchen, and she opened the tin of yellow paint and looked at it and thought about the valley full of fading light where they had sat by the fire, and she thought she knew what she would paint first. The months that followed had the quality of something being built, steadily and with care, the way good things are built. The federal investigation proceeded, slowly but with the relentless patience of institutional process. Theodore Marsh's investigators arrived in Harwick in June, examined the county records, interviewed the living witnesses, and confirmed the fraudulent signatures. Ira Boone, faced with the evidence and the certainty of federal prosecution, cooperated, which meant that Clarence Tull's connection to the Meridian Land Trust and the fraudulent transfers became officially documented. Tull hired lawyers from San Antonio. The process took the better part of a year and 3 federal hearings, but at the end of it, in the spring of 1879, the land transfers were voided. The Ketterman family, tracked down by federal correspondents to a town 50 miles west where they had resettled, was notified that their original land was theirs to reclaim if they wished it. The Sousa family's land was confirmed as legally theirs. Widow Dunmore received a new deed in her name with the official federal seal, and when Ada brought it to her at her kitchen table, the old woman held it with trembling hands and said that she had not expected justice and was not sure what to do with it, but that she was grateful. Clarence Tull did not go to prison. This was the imperfect part, the part that Ada sat with for a while and had to make her peace with through several honest conversations with Gideon and with herself. The charges that stuck were civil rather than criminal, the federal lawyers determining that proving Tull's direct knowledge of the specific fraud versus his knowing use of its results was complex enough to make criminal conviction uncertain. He paid a substantial civil judgment. He lost the Meridian Land Trust holdings. He was diminished in the community in a way that could not be recovered. It was not everything. It was justice of a certain kind, partial and imperfect and real, which was the kind of justice that actually existed in the world as opposed to the kind that existed in stories. "Are you at peace with it?" Gideon asked her, on the evening they heard the final civil judgment. They were sitting on the front step of the livery stable, which was their habit now in the early evenings, watching the town settle into its nighttime arrangements, the lights coming on in windows along the main street, the sound of the dusty spur beginning its evening noise. "Mostly," she said honestly. "The families have their land. That is the thing that matters most. Yes, Tull is smaller than he was. Community sees him as smaller, that matters. Yes." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was also their habit now, a thing that had happened gradually and then permanently. "I am thinking about the Sousa girl," she said. "Maria, she will finish my school next spring. She is exceptional, Gideon, the sharpest mind I have taught. What will she do after? I want to help her apply to a teacher's college. There is one in Austin that takes women." Ada paused. "I have written them a letter already." He turned his head to look at her. He was smiling. "Of course you have. Is that funny?" "It is wonderful," he said. "It is entirely you." She lifted her head from his shoulder to look at him properly. The evening light was doing its amber work on the world, the way it always did in Texas, turning everything it touched to something that looked like it belonged in a painting. She had, in fact, painted it twice, and both paintings were hanging in the schoolhouse. "Gideon," she said. "Ada," he said, with the warmth in it that had become her favorite sound in the English language. "I want to ask you something." He was looking at her with those copper-colored eyes and the openness that he had stopped carefully managing at some point in the past months around her. "Ask. Are you content here?" she said. "In Calhoun Creek? Are you content with your life here the way it is now?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The stable is mine. I built most of it with my own hands. I have good work and I am good at it. The town is decent in most of the ways that matter." He paused. "And you are here." "I might not always be here," she said carefully. He went still. "What are you saying?" "I am not saying I am leaving," she said quickly. "I am asking whether you have thought about what you want." "Because I have been thinking about it, about what I want and about whether what I want is possible here and about—" She stopped. She organized herself. "I want to stay here. I want to continue teaching. I want to help Maria Sousa get to Austin and get her education, and I want to keep painting this ridiculous, beautiful country, and I want—" She met his eyes. I want to stop living alone above the schoolhouse. A beat of silence. Then two. That is a fairly significant statement, he said carefully. I am a fairly direct person, she said, the smile. The real one. It broke across his face like the sun coming around a cloud, and it undid her as it always did, and she had stopped pretending that it did not. Ada Whitaker, he said, are you proposing to me? I am stating a preference and inviting a response, she said. That is somewhat different. It is somewhat the same from where I am sitting. She looked at him steadily. Well, he reached into his jacket pocket, which she had not expected at all, and what he brought out was small and made of silver, a ring with a single turquoise stone set in it, the deep sky blue of the Texas desert, the kind of stone that was mined in the territory by craftsmen who had been working it for generations. It was not an extravagant ring. It was beautiful in a way that was specific and honest. She stared at it. I have had this for 3 weeks, he said. I have been trying to determine the right moment, and then you just told me what you wanted, which seems like the right moment. She looked at the ring and then at him. 3 weeks. I am patient, he said. You know this about me. She looked at him for a long moment in the amber evening light of Calhoun Creek, this man with his copper-colored eyes and his honest hands and his compressed anger at injustice and his dry humor and his completely genuine quality that she had fallen in love with by degrees and then all at once, and she said, yes, my answer is yes. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which probably meant he had found a way to learn the size of her finger without asking her directly, which was very much like him. She looked at it on her hand. The turquoise, she said. It is the color of your voice, he said, which made no logical sense and was one of the most beautiful things anyone had ever said to her. She laughed, and then she kissed him, there on the front step of the livery stable with the amber evening all around them and the town of Calhoun Creek doing its quiet witnessing. It was their first kiss, and it was perfectly in character for both of them, unhurried and deliberate and honest, the kind of kiss that knew what it was and meant it entirely. Horace Pratt, who happened to be sweeping his porch across the street, stopped sweeping and watched with the unembarrassed curiosity of a small-town shopkeeper, and then went inside and told his wife, who told the widow Calloway before nightfall. And by morning there was not a household in Calhoun Creek that did not know that the schoolteacher and the livery stable man were getting married. They married in June of 1879, in the schoolhouse that doubled as a church, because it was Ada's place, and it seemed right. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Calhoun Creek every 3 weeks, a lean and enthusiastic man named Brother Hoskins, who conducted weddings with the same energy he applied to his sermons, and who was clearly delighted by the occasion. Most of Calhoun Creek attended, because in a small frontier community, a wedding was a significant communal event, and also because Ada and Gideon were both, in their different ways, people the town had come to depend on. The Sousa family was there, and Maria, 17 and brilliant, and already in possession of a letter of conditional acceptance from the Austin Teachers College, sat in the front row and watched Ada walk down the schoolhouse aisle with an expression of such uncomplicated delight that Ada had to work to keep her composure. Widow Dunmore sat beside the Sousa family, on land that was legally and finally hers again, in a dress she had pressed carefully for the occasion, and she held a handkerchief that she used with frequency throughout the ceremony. Gideon's brother, who had ridden down from Colorado when the letter arrived, stood beside him as witness. He was a broader version of Gideon with the same copper-colored eyes, and he shook Ada's hand after the ceremony with both of his, and told her she was the best thing that had happened to his brother in 31 years, which made Gideon say his brother's name in a specific tone that his brother ignored completely. They celebrated in the schoolyard afterward, with food brought by the whole community in the tradition of frontier communal gatherings, tables set out in the late June sunshine, and the mesquite trees moving in the warm wind. The Dusty Spurs piano player brought his instrument out and set it in the yard, and people danced in the dust with the enthusiasm of people who did not have enough occasions to dance. Gideon danced with Ada. He was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him. Tennessee upbringing, he said. We danced at things. I would like to hear more about Tennessee, she said. I will tell you everything about Tennessee, he said. I have a lifetime of Tennessee to tell you about. Good, she said. I have a lifetime of Missouri to contribute in return. They danced until the sun was low and the food was largely gone, and the children who had stayed were falling asleep in their parents' arms. And then they went home together to the house that was already theirs, a proper house that Gideon had owned since his first year in Calhoun Creek, and that Ada had helped furnish with what she called ruthless practicality. Though the 2 watercolor paintings she hung in the front room were not particularly practical, and Gideon had hung 3 more himself. The house was made of good limestone and had 4 rooms and a wide porch that faced west toward the bluffs, and on summer evenings it caught the sunset in a way that made Ada stop every single time. In the months after the wedding, life in Calhoun Creek continued to arrange itself around them in the way that life does when you have stopped fighting it and started building something in it instead. Gideon's business at the livery stable grew steadily as the town itself grew, new families arriving from the east and the north following the railroad's expansion south of them, and the opening of additional land claims. Ada's school grew with the town, and she wrote to the state education board and got a second teacher approved, a young woman named Charlotte Beale who came from San Marcos and who took to frontier life with an adaptability that Ada found deeply encouraging. They got a dog, a large and opinionated hound of uncertain parentage who arrived at the livery stable one October morning and declined to leave, and who answered to the name Aristotle, though he did not appear to have read the philosopher. In the spring of 1880, Ada told Gideon, on a Sunday morning over coffee on the west-facing porch, that they were going to have a child. He put his coffee cup down on the porch railing with extreme care, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and luminous, as if the most important lamp in him had just been lit. When? He said. October, she said, if my arithmetic is right, which it usually is. He stood up from his chair and reached for her hand, and held it with both of his and said absolutely nothing for a long time, which was somehow everything that needed to be said. In October of 1880, a boy was born, which Gideon received with the same luminous expression from the spring, and Ada received with exhaustion and overwhelming pride, and the specific knowledge that this small person screaming his indignation at the cold air of the world was the best thing she had ever had a hand in making. They named him William Thomas Morgan, after both of their fathers. William turned out to have his father's disposition, quiet and observant and deeply interested in how things worked, and he spent his early years attached to Gideon's side in the livery stable with a happiness that was obvious from approximately 6 months of age. He also had his mother's eyes, that dark color that missed nothing, which Gideon pointed out with frequency, and a pride that was not subtle. Maria Sousa went to Austin in the fall of 1880. Her fees partially paid by a collection that Ada had organized quietly and efficiently through the community, and partially by the Sousa family themselves. She wrote back to Ada every month, letters full of what she was learning, and the people she was meeting and the dimensions of the world opening up around her. And Ada read every letter twice and wrote back with the enthusiasm of a teacher who has watched a student exceed every expectation. The Ketterman family did not return to Calhoun Creek. They had rebuilt their lives in the new settlement 50 miles west and chose to remain, which was their right and which Ada understood completely. Their original land in Calhoun Creek was eventually purchased by a young farming couple who arrived from Missouri in 1881, which Ada found satisfying in a way she could not entirely explain, but which had something to do with the circular nature of things. Clarence Tull sold his remaining Calhoun Creek holdings in late 1880 and relocated to San Antonio, where he was presumably someone else's problem. His departure from the community was noted without ceremony. The dusty spur replaced his portrait, which had hung above the bar for reasons that were obscure even to the regulars, with a painted landscape of the bluffs west of town. Ira Boone, the corrupt land agent, was removed from his position and barred from county employment. He moved east and was not heard from again. The land, which had been the center of everything, remained. It was the thing that outlasted all the human maneuvering around it. The bluffs west of Calhoun Creek caught the sunset in the same way they always had. The creek ran through the center of the town and over its stones with the same continuous sound. The mesquite moved in the same warm wind. Ada painted it. She painted the bluffs in the morning light and the creek in the blue hour before sunset and the schoolyard with the children in their mid-morning lesson outdoors on the days when the weather was kind. She painted the livery stable from the east angle where the wide doors caught the amber afternoon, and she painted Gideon once, without telling him she was doing it, from memory, in the specific quality of light that she associated most with him, which was the last of the day, when everything went honest. He found the painting half-finished on her painting table one evening and stood looking at it for a long time. "That is me," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are good," he said. Not as a compliment deployed casually, but as a genuine observation delivered with his usual precision. "I know," she said, because she was, and because she had stopped being modest about it. He hung the finished version in their bedroom, which she pretended to object to on grounds of vanity, and which she was secretly pleased about every morning. In the spring of 1882, they had their second child, a daughter this time, born in March when the bluebonnets were starting in the fields south of town. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because it was the name that seemed to fit her face when they first saw it, and naming things what they are is always the right approach. Clara was loud and decisive from the beginning, with red in her hair that no one could account for genetically, but which everyone agreed suited her, and she grew at a rate that suggested she planned to be formidable. William, 18 months old and sovereign of his particular domain in the livery stable, accepted his sister with the equanimity of a child who has been raised among horses, and has therefore developed a philosophical approach to the unpredictable. Gideon watched his daughter in her first weeks with the same luminous quality he had brought to William's arrival, and Ada watched Gideon watching their children, and felt something that was too large for precise language, but that she had stopped trying to name because it was better simply felt. They sat together on the west-facing porch on a June evening in 1882, the year Clara was born, with the last of the sunset on the bluffs turning everything the color of warm copper, which always reminded Ada of Gideon's eyes. William was asleep inside, and Clara was in Ada's arms making the small investigating noises of a baby recently fed, and Aristotle, the hound, was arranged at Gideon's feet, with the dignity of a dog who has long since made peace with his place in the world. The town of Calhoun Creek was doing its evening things around them. Lights in windows and the distant sound of the dusty Spurs piano, and the bark of someone's dog answering Aristotle's occasional comment on the dusk. Ada looked at her daughter's face and at the bluffs in the last light, and at the man sitting beside her with his elbows on his knees and his quiet steadiness that was as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. "I have been thinking," she said. "Good," he said. "Tell me." "I have been thinking about 6 months," she said. "The 6 months I kept quiet." He looked at her. "What about them?" "I think about them sometimes, about what was happening during those 6 months and why." She was quiet for a moment, watching Clara's face. "I was so afraid of what speaking would cost that I did not see clearly what the silence was costing. The Kettermans, the Souses, Widow Dunmore. The people who were losing things while I was being careful about myself." "You protected your students," he said. "Yes, and I do not fully regret the caution, but I think—" She paused. "I think that sometimes the cost of keeping quiet is higher than we can see from the inside, because we can see clearly what speaking might cost and we cannot see as clearly what staying silent is taking away." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What made you finally speak?" "Maria Souse's jaw," she said, "and the Ketterman's empty house. The abstract cost became specific and I could not hold the silence any more." She looked at him. And you, I knew I was going to tell you specifically. Not just anyone. He held her gaze. Why me? Because you were the person I trusted most in the world, she said. By that point, without quite realizing when that had happened. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, the day you told me, in the livery stable, I have thought about that day quite a lot. What do you think about it? I think it was the day things changed, for both of us. Not just the practical things, the investigation and the land records, but he looked at the bluffs. I think it was the day I understood what it felt like to be trusted with something real, something that mattered beyond the ordinary mattering of things. He paused. I had not known. I was waiting for that until it happened. Ada looked at him, this man who had been patient and steady and present through everything that had followed the afternoon in the livery stable, through the long ride to Austin and the federal depositions and Tull's visit to the schoolhouse and the months of process and the wedding and William and Clara, and all the ordinary days between the significant ones that were, she had come to understand, where the actual life lived. Neither had I, she said. Clara made a small sound of opinion, which they both looked at her for, and then Clara subsided into the satisfied expression of a baby who has made her point. She is going to be very much like you, Gideon said. God help you both, Ada said. He laughed. The full version, the one that happened rarely and was therefore treasured. It filled the porch and the evening and the space between the bluffs and the stars beginning to emerge above them. And Aristotle raised his head to register it, and then lowered it again with the philosophical acceptance of a hound who has learned to live with the irrational emotionality of humans. The years settled around them like the country itself, vast and specific, demanding and beautiful, shaped by the same stubbornness that Gideon had identified in both the land and the people who chose to live in it. There were hard winters and good harvests and school years that went well and ones that were difficult, and horses that got through everything fine and horses that did not. There were town meetings and celebrations and the ordinary grief of frontier life, which came as it always does, in ways that tested what people were made of and generally found the making sufficient. William grew into a boy who could handle a horse by the time he was 5 and read by the time he was 4, in that order, which his parents found deeply characteristic. Clara grew into a girl who conducted herself at all times as if she had not yet decided whether the world was ready for her, but was willing to give it the chance to demonstrate. Maria Sousa came back to Calhoun Creek in 1883 with her teaching certificate and a quiet confidence that made Ada's chest swell every time she saw it. She took over the new second classroom in what had become a proper 2-room schoolhouse, and she and Ada taught together for years, the first woman who had come to this place to teach and the student who had become one because of it. There was a day in the fall of 1884, 6 years after Ada had stood in the county land office in Harwick, and seen what she was not supposed to have seen, when she was riding west toward the bluffs on her Saturday morning ride. She had taken to riding alone on Saturday mornings in the early hours before the household woke fully, a practice Gideon supported with complete understanding, because he knew she needed the open space the way some people need silence, as a restoration of something that the week's work used up. She rode to the base of the bluffs and stopped her horse on the flat limestone ledge where she had started painting 3 years ago and looked out at Calhoun Creek below her, the main street with its familiar buildings, the schoolhouse with its neat yard, the livery stable with its wide open doors, the curl of smoke from the household chimneys in the cool morning air. She could see, from this distance, the specific square of the Morgan house, hers and Gideon's and William's and Clara's and Aristotle's, and the 2 additional horses they had acquired in the past year, one for William, and one that Ada had chosen for herself from a new string Gideon had brought in from a rancher east of town. She thought about 6 months of silence and what had lived inside it, and what had come after the speaking. She thought about how the thing she had been most afraid of had been standing in that livery stable telling Gideon Morgan what she knew, and how it had been the least frightening thing she had ever done, in the actual moment of doing it, because she had been afraid for so long that the relief of no longer being afraid was immediate and physical and real. She thought about all the things that had come from that afternoon. The families with their land restored, the partial imperfect justice that was nonetheless actual justice, Maria Sousa in a classroom with children who needed her, William and Clara sleeping in their beds in the limestone house below the bluffs, and Gideon, who was probably already in the livery stable at this hour, who would look up when she returned and hold her horse while she dismounted and ask how the ride was with the specific quality of interest that meant he genuinely wanted to know. She pulled her small notebook from her saddlebag, not the one with the land records which was in Austin in federal files, but a newer one, softer leather, that she used for the thoughts that needed organizing. She wrote in it for a few minutes, looking up occasionally at the view that she had painted 4 times now and would probably paint 4 times more. She wrote, "There is a cost to silence that is not visible from the inside, and there is a cost to speaking that is also real. The question is not whether there is a cost. The question is which cost you can live with." She looked at what she had written. Then she added, "and whether you are carrying it alone." She closed the notebook and put it away and turned her horse back toward town, toward the square of the limestone house and the livery stable with its wide open doors, and the man with copper-colored eyes who had stood beside her through everything that had followed the afternoon she finally spoke. And she rode home through the cool October morning with the bluffs at her back, and everything she had built ahead of her. And she was, in the full and specific and daily sense of the word, happy. Gideon was indeed already in the livery stable when she arrived. He was working on something with a piece of harness leather, and he looked up when she came in, and his face did what it had always done when she appeared, which was open slightly, as if her presence was something that made the room more of what it should be. He came to hold her horse as he always did, and she dismounted, and he did not immediately release the bridle but stood close to her in the amber morning light of the stable. "Good ride," he said. "Very good," she said. "I was thinking." "About what?" She looked at him. The light was doing what it always did, making him honest, making everything visible. "About how glad I am that I told you," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the copper-colored steadiness that she would never fully get used to, which was, she suspected, the right way for it to be. "So am I," he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which she did sometimes, just to feel the realness of him, and he covered her hand with his and held it there. "We should go in," she said. "William will want breakfast and Clara will be conducting some kind of operation that requires adult supervision." "Probably," he said, but he did not move. "Gideon, Ada, come on then." He smiled, the real one, and let go of the bridle and walked with her across the morning yard toward the house, where through the window they could already see the small shapes of their children moving in the kitchen, beginning the day with the complete confidence of children who know where they are and that they are loved, which is the best thing a person can begin a day with, and which Ada and Gideon Morgan had made sure was the foundation their children would always be able to stand on, the way solid ground should be. The way the limestone bluffs above Calhoun Creek had always been, immovable and patient and entirely, enduringly there.